The last thing my mother ever said to me before I disappeared from the family was, "You are the only child I'm ashamed of." And the worst part? Everyone else at the table agreed. My sister Rachel stared down into her wine glass like she suddenly found it fascinating. My older brother Daniel leaned back in his chair with the kind of smile people wear when they're relieved someone else became the target. My father sat frozen beside the kitchen window, silent enough to disappear into the wallpaper. And me? I was still standing there holding the casserole dish I had spent 3 hours making for a Mother's Day dinner I wasn't even wanted at anymore. I remember thinking how strange it was that humiliation could feel so quiet. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just the sound of silverware touching plates while my mother calmly erased me from the family like she was correcting a typo on a piece of paper. 3 years later, that same woman would sit under the bright lights of a national television studio praising a novel she called the most emotionally honest American story she had read in years, never realizing the daughter she buried emotionally had written every single word. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Emily Carter, and for most of my life I believed families were like old houses. Even when the walls cracked and the paint peeled, you stayed because it was still home. I grew up in a coastal Oregon town called Bellport, the kind of place where everybody knew what church you attended, what your father did for work, and how much money your family probably had based on the condition of your front porch. My mother, Linda Carter, cared deeply about appearances. More deeply than she cared about honesty sometimes. She liked polished things. Polished furniture. Polished conversations. Polished children. My brother Daniel fit perfectly into the version of life she wanted displayed to the world. He became a corporate attorney in Chicago before he turned 35. My sister Rachel married a real estate developer who owned vacation properties in Arizona and Aspen. Their lives looked expensive in photographs, and to my mother, expensive often meant successful. Then there was me. The middle child. The elementary school teacher who drove a 12-year-old Honda with a broken heater and spent weekends grading reading assignments while my siblings attended wine tastings and charity galas. The strange part is I never thought I was failing at life. I loved teaching. I loved the smell of old books and freshly sharpened pencils. I loved hearing children struggle through paragraphs in September and reading confidently by May. I loved watching shy students slowly become visible. But to my mother, teaching was something people settled for after their real dreams didn't work out. She never said it directly when I was younger. Instead, she used softer weapons. At family dinners she'd ask Daniel about million-dollar lawsuits for 20 minutes before turning to me and saying, "And how are the little classroom projects going?" Rachel would laugh politely while checking her phone. My father would clear his throat like he wanted to say something but didn't trust himself enough to actually say it. Over time, I became the emotional background noise of the Carter family. Present, but barely acknowledged. What nobody knew was that every night after work, after lesson plans and grading papers and eating dinner alone in my tiny apartment overlooking the marina, I wrote stories. I had been writing since I was 14 years old. While other girls kept journals about crushes and dances, I filled notebooks with characters who survived loneliness and disappointment. Writing became the one place where I didn't feel invisible. But I kept it hidden because the few times I mentioned wanting to write seriously, my family reacted like I'd announced plans to become an astronaut at 40 years old. Daniel once laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. Rachel told me everybody thinks they can write a book until they actually try. My mother simply said, "Emily, you need hobbies that don't distract you from reality." For years I tried to earn their approval anyway. I attended every holiday gathering. Bought thoughtful birthday gifts I couldn't really afford. Helped my father repair his fishing shed every summer. I convinced myself that if I stayed kind long enough, eventually they would soften toward me. But families sometimes create invisible roles for each person, and once they decide who you are, escaping that role becomes almost impossible. Daniel was the successful son. Rachel was the admired daughter. I became the cautionary tale. The child relatives referenced quietly when discussing wasted potential. The night everything finally broke started with a message in the Carter family group chat. It was the evening before Mother's Day. I had just finished grading spelling tests when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. My mother's message appeared at the top of the screen. Tomorrow's dinner reservation is confirmed for 7 p.m. Daniel and Rachel, can't wait to celebrate with my successful children. At first I thought maybe there was another message coming. Something unfinished. I stared at the screen waiting for my name to appear. It never did. A few seconds later Rachel responded with a heart emoji. Daniel wrote, looking forward to it. That was all. No one asked why I wasn't invited. No one mentioned it at all. I sat there alone in my apartment rereading those messages until nearly 2 in the morning. There's a certain kind of pain that only comes from realizing your absence makes people more comfortable than your presence. That was the night I understood my family had stopped seeing me as temporary disappointment and started seeing me as permanent embarrassment. I should have stayed home the next evening. Looking back now, I know that. But some part of me still believed there had been a misunderstanding. So I cooked anyway. Chicken casserole with rosemary potatoes, my mother's favorite meal back when I was a child, and she still kissed my forehead before school. I drove 20 minutes through cold rain convincing myself everything would feel normal once I walked through the front door. Instead, the moment I entered the dining room, every conversation stopped. My mother looked up from the table slowly, disappointment already settling across her face before I even spoke. Emily, she said carefully, I didn't think you were coming. I remember gripping the hot casserole dish tighter because suddenly I needed something solid to hold on to. Rachel wouldn't look at me. Daniel smirked slightly before taking another sip of wine. My father stared at his folded hands. Then my mother said the sentence that changed the direction of my entire life. You are the only child I'm ashamed of. Nobody defended me. That's the part people struggle to understand when I tell this story now. It wasn't only what my mother said. It was the silence afterward. Silence has weight when it comes from people who are supposed to love you. I stood there feeling every year of rejection collapse onto that single moment. My mother continued speaking calmly, explaining that she was tired of watching me waste my intelligence on a small life. She said I hid inside classrooms because I was afraid of ambition. She said I lacked drive, vision, courage. Daniel nodded along slightly like she was making reasonable points during a business meeting. Rachel finally looked at me, but there was pity in her eyes, and somehow pity hurt worse than cruelty. Then my mother said something I would replay in my head for years afterward. She said, you could have been somebody, Emily. I didn't cry. I think that disappointed her a little. Instead, I placed the casserole dish quietly on the kitchen counter, picked up my coat, and walked toward the front door. My father finally spoke then, but only to say my name softly like he hoped whispering it would somehow undo everything that had just happened. I stopped with my hand on the door handle. For 1 second I almost turned around. Almost apologized for becoming the version of me they hated. But then another thought entered my mind, calm and sharp. What if they were wrong about me? What if I had spent my whole life asking permission from people who had already decided not to value me? So I opened the door and stepped out into the rain without saying goodbye. And none of them, not my mother, not my brother, not even my father, had any idea that upstairs in my apartment sat a manuscript that would eventually place my name in bookstores across the country. The message arrived on a Thursday evening while cold rain pressed against the windows of my apartment hard enough to sound like someone tapping quietly from outside. I had just finished grading 22 reading comprehension tests at my kitchen table. There was tomato soup growing cold beside me and a stack of unfinished lesson plans waiting for the next morning. Bellport was the kind of town that became completely silent after dark except for the marina foghorns drifting in from the coast every few hours. I remember reaching for my phone absent-mindedly when it buzzed because for a moment, before I saw the screen, I actually felt happy. That sounds embarrassing to admit now, but even at 34 years old some part of me still reacted to family notifications with the same hopeful instinct I had as a child. Maybe this time things would feel normal. Maybe this time my mother was reaching out because she missed me. Maybe this time I wasn't going to feel like the extra person at the edge of someone else's life. The Carter family group chat was usually active around holidays because my mother treated family gatherings like public events that required coordination worthy of a political campaign. Every detail mattered to her. Seating arrangements. Wine selections. Which relatives were invited and which ones were quietly excluded. When I opened the message thread, I saw my mother's name at the top followed by a long paragraph. Even now I can still remember the strange sinking feeling that settled into my chest before I even finished reading it, like some part of me already understood where the message was heading before my brain caught up to the words. All my children will be joining us for Mother's Day dinner this Sunday, she wrote. Daniel is flying in from Chicago and Rachel rearranged her schedule to make it work. It means a lot to me when family prioritizes success and commitment. Except Emily. Some people choose failure and need to live with it. I stared at the screen for several seconds, convinced I had misunderstood something. The human mind does that sometimes when pain arrives too suddenly. It searches desperately for alternate meanings because the truth feels too sharp to accept immediately. I reread the message once. Then again. Then slower. The words didn't change. My mother had excluded me publicly from a family holiday and somehow managed to make it sound reasonable. Worse than that, she made it sound deserved. For a while the chat stayed silent. 3 little gray dots appeared briefly under Rachel's name, disappeared, then returned again. I remember watching those typing bubbles with the kind of nervous anticipation people usually reserve for medical results or late-night phone calls. A small irrational part of me thought maybe Rachel was about to defend me. Maybe she was finally going to say our mother had crossed a line. Instead, a red heart emoji appeared beneath Linda Carter's message. Nothing else. Just a heart. Clean. Simple. Effortless. Daniel responded less than 30 seconds later. Probably for the best. That was it. No argument. No hesitation. No discomfort. Just quiet agreement. I set my phone face down on the kitchen table and listened to the rain hitting the windows. Somewhere outside, a boat horn echoed through the marina fog. The soup beside me had gone completely cold, but I couldn't bring myself to move. There are moments in life when humiliation becomes so complete it almost leaves your body numb afterward. Not dramatic numbness. Not cinematic heartbreak. Just emptiness. Like suddenly realizing you'd been attending a funeral without understanding the person being buried was your place inside the family. I wish I could say I reacted immediately. That I stood up for myself or sent some long emotional message exposing years of cruelty. But that's not what happened. I sat there alone in my apartment for nearly 2 hours rereading the conversation in total silence. Every few minutes I unlocked my phone hoping maybe another message had appeared. Maybe my father had privately apologized. Maybe Rachel had changed her mind. Maybe Daniel had realized how cruel he sounded. Nothing came. The chat remained frozen exactly as it was. My mother's rejection sitting at the top of the screen while my siblings' responses settled beneath it like signatures on an agreement everyone except me already understood. Around midnight I walked over to the small desk beside my bedroom window where my manuscript sat stacked in uneven pages beside my laptop. 6 years of work. 6 years of early mornings, sleepless nights, and stolen hours between lesson planning and grocery shopping. 6 years writing scenes about loneliness and invisibility while secretly hoping none of it was actually true about my own life. I remember touching the manuscript carefully like it belonged to someone else. My mother's voice kept replaying inside my head. Some people choose failure and need to live with it. The terrifying thing about hearing disappointment long enough is eventually it stops sounding cruel and starts sounding accurate. I opened my laptop slowly and stared at the folder containing the novel. 43 chapters. Hundreds of pages. Thousands of hours nobody knew existed. For the first time since I started writing it, I seriously considered deleting all of it. Every sentence. Every chapter. Every piece of evidence that somewhere deep down I had once believed my thoughts mattered enough to become a story. That night, I almost deleted the manuscript I'd spent 6 years writing. I didn't delete the manuscript that night. Honestly, I came close enough that even now I still remember the exact position my hand was in above the keyboard. One click and 6 years would have disappeared forever. But something stopped me. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe pride. Or maybe because deep down, beneath all the embarrassment and rejection and loneliness, writing was the only part of my life that still felt completely mine. So instead of deleting the files, I closed the laptop and sat there until sunrise watching fog drift across the Bellport Marina outside my apartment window. By 7 in the morning, I was back inside my classroom pretending everything was normal. That became the pattern of my life for a long time. Existing as two completely different versions of myself depending on the hour of the day. By morning, I was Miss Carter, the quiet third-grade teacher with coffee stains on her lesson plans and dark circles hidden under makeup from sleeping 4 hours a night. I earned just enough to cover rent, groceries, and student loan payments if nothing unexpected happened that month. My classroom ceiling leaked whenever it rained heavily, and every year the school district promised repairs that never came. Parents occasionally treated teachers like customer service employees instead of human beings. Some afternoons I stayed after school helping children who struggled with reading while their parents forgot to pick them up on time. Nobody called people like me successful. Necessary sometimes. Dependable maybe. But never successful. Then nighttime came and my real life started. I would return to my apartment exhausted, kick off my shoes beside the door, microwave whatever cheap dinner I could throw together quickly, and sit down at the tiny wooden desk near the window overlooking the water. Most nights it was macaroni, frozen dinners, or canned soup eaten while rereading chapters one had already rewritten 10 times before. The apartment itself was small enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming from the bedroom. During winter storms, cold air slipped through the old window frames hard enough that I sometimes wrote wearing gloves with the fingertips cut off. But once I opened the manuscript, none of that seemed to matter anymore. The world became quiet in a completely different way. The novel consumed nearly every private part of my life. I wrote after grading papers until midnight. I wrote during school breaks while other teachers traveled. I wrote through migraines, fevers, heartbreak, loneliness, and insomnia. Some nights the words arrived so naturally it felt like someone was dictating them into my head. Other nights I stared at the blinking cursor for hours convinced my mother had been right all along and I was wasting my life chasing something embarrassing and unrealistic. There were evenings I cried quietly at my desk after rejection emails arrived because the language publishers used always sounded strangely personal even when it wasn't meant to. Unfortunately, this project does not fit our current needs. We were unable to connect with the material. The market is difficult right now. After the 15th rejection, I stopped checking my email immediately because disappointment had started affecting me physically. My chest tightened every time I saw messages from literary agents appear on my screen. And still, nobody knew. Not my coworkers. Not my neighbors. Not even my family. Especially not my family. I became skilled at hiding entire emotional worlds from people. During holidays I smiled politely while Rachel described luxury resorts in Italy. I listened to Daniel discuss 6-figure legal deals while secretly wondering whether I had enough money left in my account to pay my electric bill after rent cleared. My mother continued introducing me to distant relatives as Emily, the teacher, with the same careful tone people use when discussing fragile situations. Sometimes I wanted to tell them all about the manuscript just to see their reactions. But another part of me already knew what those reactions would be. Pity from my father. Polite amusement from Rachel. Smug skepticism from Daniel. Disappointment from Linda Carter. So I kept writing in silence. The funny thing about rejection is eventually it teaches you how to disappear emotionally before you disappear physically. You stop volunteering personal details. You stop expecting encouragement. You begin editing yourself in conversations the same way writers edit unnecessary paragraphs from rough drafts. Over time, I became smaller around my family without even noticing it happening. Quieter. More careful. Easier to ignore. By 34, I had spent so many years feeling underestimated that invisibility almost started feeling safer than hope. Then, 3 weeks after the Mother's Day group chat incident, something happened that changed the direction of everything. It was a Tuesday evening near the end of October. Rain hammered against the apartment windows while I sat at my desk revising chapter 27 for what felt like the 100th time. My microwave dinner had gone cold beside me again because I kept forgetting to eat while editing. Around 11:40 p.m., my laptop notification sound interrupted the silence. At first I ignored it because rejection emails usually arrived late at night for some reason, almost like publishers preferred disappointing strangers after business hours. But eventually I clicked the notification anyway. The email came from a small independent publishing company in New York called Hawthorne House Press. I remember reading the first sentence 3 times because I genuinely thought I misunderstood it. "We would love to discuss publication opportunities for your manuscript." My hands actually started shaking. After 6 years of rejection, silence, and private humiliation, someone had finally said yes. Not a massive publisher. Not life-changing money. Not fame. Just yes. And somehow that tiny word carried more emotional weight than anything I had heard in years. I should have called someone. Most people would have. My father maybe. A friend. Even Rachel. But I didn't. I sat there alone in my apartment rereading the email while rain struck the windows and tears rolled down my face quietly enough that nobody else in the world knew they existed. Then I opened the family group chat, stared at it for a few seconds, and closed it again without typing a single word. Because by then, I had already decided my family would never be part of my success. Success changes people slowly at first. Not externally. Not in the dramatic movie sense where someone suddenly becomes confident overnight and walks into rooms differently. Real change happens privately, almost invisibly. It starts in the small moments. The way disappointment stops feeling permanent. The way silence becomes less painful. The way you begin protecting parts of yourself from people who only know how to damage them. After Hawthorne House Press offered me a publishing deal, something inside me shifted quietly. I still taught 3rd grade every morning. I still drove the same old Honda through rainy Bellport streets. I still spent evenings grading papers at my kitchen table. But for the first time in years, I carried a secret that belonged entirely to me. A future nobody in my family could criticize because none of them even knew it existed yet. Over the next few months, my novel moved through editing with Hawthorne House Press while the rest of my life continued exactly the same on the surface. That became the strangest part of the experience. During the day I attended parent conferences and reminded 8-year-olds not to run in hallways while somewhere in New York people discussed cover designs and marketing plans for a story I had written alone beside a fog-covered marina. Sometimes I would receive emails from my editor during lunch breaks and have to pretend nothing important had happened before returning to phonics lessons and multiplication worksheets. The separation between my public life and private reality became so extreme it almost felt unreal. And the more exciting things became professionally, the less interested I felt in sharing anything with my family. Then Christmas arrived. My mother insisted everyone come home that year because Daniel had recently made partner at his law firm and Rachel wanted to film some kind of holiday lifestyle campaign for her social media pages. I almost didn't go. Honestly, if my father hadn't called personally asking me to come, I probably would have stayed in my apartment with takeout food and my manuscript edits. But guilt has a powerful way of disguising itself as obligation inside families. So 3 days before Christmas, I packed an overnight bag and drove to the Carter house telling myself I could survive one weekend. The moment I walked inside, I remembered why I had started emotionally distancing myself from them in the first place. Rachel was already filming videos in the living room wearing expensive cream-colored clothes that somehow looked untouched by real life. Daniel stood near the fireplace discussing investment properties over speakerphone loud enough for everyone to hear numbers that exceeded my yearly salary. My mother greeted me politely but distractedly, like I was a guest who arrived slightly too early to an important event. Only my father hugged me long enough to feel genuine. Dinner that night started the same way every Carter family dinner started. Wine poured. Polite conversation. Daniel discussing work. Rachel talking about brand partnerships and luxury hotels. My mother glowing with pride every time one of them spoke. I stayed mostly quiet, answering questions when necessary and pushing food around my plate more than actually eating it. Somewhere between the salad and the main course, Rachel started talking about private schools and how difficult it must be for public school teachers to deal with other people's badly raised children all day. She laughed after saying it, but not enough to make it sound entirely like a joke. Then my mother joined in. "You know," Linda Carter said while adjusting her napkin carefully across her lap, "teachers really are just babysitters with degrees when you think about it." Daniel laughed immediately. Not a forced laugh. Not an uncomfortable laugh. A real one. Rachel smiled into her wine glass before adding, "At least babysitters make decent money now." The table went quiet afterward, but not the kind of silence that follows cruelty. It was the silence of people waiting to see whether I would react strongly enough to make things awkward. My father stared down at his plate again. Daniel took another sip of wine casually like nothing unusual had happened. Rachel avoided eye contact. And my mother looked at me with that familiar expression she always wore after insulting me publicly. Calm. Confident. Almost irritated by the possibility of being challenged. I wish I could explain exactly what broke inside me during that moment, but the truth is emotional breaking points rarely arrive dramatically. They arrive through accumulation. One humiliation layered on top of another until suddenly the weight becomes impossible to carry politely anymore. I looked around the table realizing I had spent years shrinking myself emotionally just to remain acceptable inside a family that had already decided I would never be enough for them anyway. So instead of defending myself, I stood up quietly. Nobody stopped me. That detail stayed with me afterward more than anything else. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate, thanked my father for dinner out of habit, and walked toward the front door while the rest of the family remained seated around the table. Behind me, I could hear silverware lightly touching plates again as conversation cautiously restarted. It felt less like leaving a family dinner and more like walking out of a room where people had finally stopped pretending they valued your presence. Outside, cold December air hit me immediately. The Carter house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with old pine trees, and Christmas lights from neighboring homes reflected faintly against the wet pavement. I reached my car before hearing the front door open behind me. "Emily." My mother's voice. I turned slowly. Linda Carter stood on the porch wrapped in a gray wool coat, arms crossed tightly against the cold. For a second she almost looked uncertain, which unsettled me more than anger would have. She walked halfway down the driveway before stopping beneath the porch light. "I don't understand why you always make things so personal," she said carefully. "People joke at dinner. That's normal." I didn't answer. My mother sighed softly, frustrated now. "You're 34 years old, Emily. At some point you need to accept reality. Daniel built something meaningful. Rachel built something meaningful. She paused there, searching for the right words. You could have been somebody." The sentence landed differently this time. Maybe because deep down, for the first time in my life, I no longer believed she was right. I looked at my mother standing there beneath the yellow porch light, still convinced my worth depended entirely on whether other people admired me publicly. Then I thought about the publishing contract sitting hidden inside my apartment desk drawer. The manuscript she knew nothing about. The life quietly unfolding beyond her understanding. And suddenly, instead of anger, I felt something stranger. Freedom. I opened my car door slowly before looking back at her one last time. "Maybe I already am," I said softly. Then I got into my car and drove away. I didn't go back to the Carter house after that Christmas dinner. At first, nobody seemed particularly concerned about it. A week passed without a single message from Rachel. Daniel sent one short text asking whether I still planned on mailing our father's birthday gift jointly with everyone else, but nothing about the argument itself. My mother remained completely silent. The absence almost felt intentional, like the family had quietly decided to continue without me and were waiting to see how long it would take before I returned apologizing for being difficult. But this time something inside me had changed permanently. For years I had mistaken endurance for loyalty. I thought surviving disrespect proved love. Now, for the first time in my life, distance started feeling healthier than hope. 3 months later, I left Bellport. Not dramatically. No emotional farewell. No announcement online. I simply packed my life into cardboard boxes over the course of 2 rainy weekends and moved 2 hours north to a smaller coastal town outside Astoria, Oregon. The apartment I rented sat above an old bookstore near the harbor. It was tiny. 1 bedroom. Slanted ceilings. Thin walls. But it overlooked the water, and for the first time in years, nobody there knew anything about the Carter family. I changed my phone number the week after moving. Not because I wanted revenge. Honestly, revenge requires emotional energy, and by then I was exhausted in a deeper way than anger could reach. I changed it because I wanted silence. Real silence. The kind that allows a person to hear their own thoughts again after years of criticism. The strange thing is, almost nobody tried very hard to find me. My father emailed twice asking whether I was safe. Rachel sent a short Instagram message saying everyone hoped I was doing okay emotionally. Daniel didn't contact me at all. And my mother? Linda Carter told relatives I was going through a phase and needed space to mature. Later I would hear from cousins that she described my move as proof that I couldn't handle honest conversations about my life choices. Somehow, even my disappearance became another example of my supposed failure. So I disappeared completely. And quietly, my real life finally began. The next 2 years passed in fragments that blurred together like scenes from separate lives stitched into one story. Winter mornings waking before sunrise to teach reading lessons at a small elementary school outside Astoria. Long evenings editing my manuscript beside the bookstore window while rain hammered against the harbor streets below. Rejection letters arriving from larger publishers after Hawthorne House Press struggled financially and delayed production repeatedly. Cheap coffee growing cold beside my laptop at 2 in the morning while entire chapters were rewritten from scratch. There were nights I fell asleep at my desk with my glasses still on and woke up to seagulls crying outside the window at dawn. Some evenings loneliness arrived so heavily that I walked through bookstores pretending to browse simply because being surrounded by stories made me feel less invisible. But slowly, almost painfully slowly, things started changing. The manuscript became stronger. Then stronger again. My editor at Hawthorne House Press pushed me harder than anyone ever had before. She cut entire sections without apology. Forced me to rewrite emotional scenes I thought were already finished. Challenged every dishonest sentence. At first the criticism devastated me because after years of family rejection, any form of disapproval still felt personal. But eventually I understood something important. Real belief pushes you to become better. Mockery only tries to make you smaller. My editor believed in the story enough to demand more from it. That realization changed the way I viewed my entire life. Meanwhile, back in Bellport, the Carter family continued exactly as before. Rachel posted glamorous vacation photos online with captions about gratitude and success. Daniel bought a lake house outside Chicago. My mother hosted dinner parties where she introduced her children proudly and spoke about me less and less each year. Sometimes distant relatives mentioned seeing my family at restaurants or church events, and every story sounded identical. Nobody asked where Emily was. Nobody wondered why I stopped coming home. My absence settled naturally into the structure of their lives, like furniture being removed from a room people eventually stopped noticing. Once, about a year after I moved, I accidentally overheard Rachel speaking about me during a phone call with a cousin. I had answered an unknown number thinking it might be my school district. Instead, I heard Rachel laughing softly before realizing the call connected accidentally through Bluetooth in her car. She always took everything too seriously, Rachel said. Honestly, disappearing was probably healthier for everyone. Healthier for everyone. I still remember sitting there staring at the harbor outside my apartment window after the call disconnected, realizing how easily people rewrite history once you're gone long enough. In their version of events, I wasn't hurt. I was unstable. Oversensitive. Difficult. My family had transformed years of emotional neglect into a story where my reaction became the actual problem. But by then, something else was happening quietly beyond their understanding. The manuscript they mocked without ever reading was beginning to attract attention. Small attention at first. An independent literary blog mentioned an early excerpt online. Then a regional reviewer praised the emotional realism of the writing. Hawthorne House Press finally confirmed a release date. I published under the name E.M. Hayes because some part of me still wanted separation between Emily Carter, the family disappointment, and the woman who had written the story that was slowly finding its audience. Every step forward felt surreal because nobody around me knew. I still taught children multiplication during the day while secretly receiving emails about marketing meetings and early review copies at night. Then one freezing January morning, nearly 3 years after I walked out of the Carter family dinner for the last time, my phone rang while I was unlocking my classroom door before sunrise. The call came from New York. And then, one phone call changed everything. The call came at 6:12 in the morning while frost still covered the harbor sidewalks outside my classroom. I remember balancing a cardboard box of reading workbooks against my hip while fumbling for my phone because almost nobody called me that early unless something was wrong. For one terrifying second, I thought it might be my father. But the number on the screen was from Manhattan, New York. My publisher. At first, the woman on the other end sounded too excited for me to fully understand what she was saying. Her voice kept breaking apart through static while words like sales numbers, national attention, and unexpected response blurred together faster than my brain could process them. Finally, she laughed softly and said something that made me stop walking completely. "Emily, your book is exploding online." Even now, years later, I still think that sentence sounds unreal. Because nothing about my life up to that point had prepared me for what happened next. The novel released quietly at first under the name E.M. Hayes. No giant launch campaign. No massive advertising budget. Hawthorne House Press was too small for that. The first week only a few hundred copies sold. Then somebody posted an emotional review online describing the story as the most honest portrayal of loneliness inside a family they had ever read. A book club in Seattle picked it for their monthly discussion. Then another in Boston. Then a podcast host recommended it during an interview about overlooked fiction. Within 3 weeks, strangers across the country were quoting lines from chapters one had written alone in sweatpants beside a leaking apartment window at 2 in the morning. The reviews became impossible to ignore. People wrote about crying in parked cars after finishing the ending. Teachers posted photos of highlighted passages online. Women in their 50s described feeling seen for the first time in years. Men wrote long comments admitting the novel made them call estranged daughters they hadn't spoken to in months. One reviewer described the book as quietly devastating in the most human way possible. Another called it a story about emotional invisibility disguised as fiction. Every morning I woke up to more messages from strangers connecting deeply with words my own family once would have mocked without reading. And through all of it, nobody in the Carter family had any idea. That became the strangest part. While my novel climbed online bestseller charts, I still taught multiplication tables during the day and bought groceries at the same tiny harbor market near my apartment. Parents still saw me as Miss Carter, the calm elementary school teacher who stayed late helping struggling students after class. My family still thought I was somewhere in Oregon living a small forgettable life. Rachel occasionally posted vague social media quotes about protecting your peace. Daniel continued building his law career in Chicago. My mother hosted dinner parties and charity luncheons pretending she had only 2 children worth mentioning publicly. Meanwhile, E.M. Hayes was becoming a name people recognized. The first interview happened over Zoom with a regional literary magazine. I kept my camera angled carefully so nobody could see the modest apartment behind me. Then came podcasts, radio interviews, independent bookstores inviting me to speak. One video review went viral after a woman broke down crying while describing how the story reminded her of growing up feeling unwanted by her own mother. Sales doubled overnight after that. Then doubled again. 3 months later, the novel appeared on a national bestseller list. I stared at the screen in disbelief the morning the rankings were published. E.M. Hayes sat between authors I had admired for years, people whose books filled the shelves of the bookstore beneath my apartment. For several minutes I just sat there in silence with coffee growing cold in my hands while seagulls drifted across the harbor outside. Success didn't feel triumphant the way movies always portray it. It felt disorienting. Quiet. Almost lonely. Because the people I once desperately wanted validation from still had no idea what was happening. And honestly, part of me wanted to keep it that way forever. Then things escalated again. A celebrity book club selected the novel for its monthly feature after a famous actress described it during an interview as the kind of story that stays in your chest long after you finish reading it. Overnight, demand exploded. Major publishers began contacting Hawthorne House Press asking about foreign rights and film options. Independent bookstores started displaying the novel in front windows. Strangers posted photographs reading it on airplanes, beaches, hospital waiting rooms, and subway platforms across the country. The story I wrote during years of isolation had somehow found people everywhere. Still, I never contacted my family. Not once. Sometimes late at night I imagined what my mother would say if she ever discovered the truth. Would she apologize? Would she pretend she always believed in me? Would Daniel suddenly respect writing once enough money became attached to it? Would Rachel start posting photographs holding the book online like she had supported me all along? The questions haunted me more than I expected. But every time I considered reaching out, another memory surfaced. My mother calling teachers babysitters with degrees. Daniel laughing. Rachel's heart emoji beneath the family group chat message excluding me from Mother's Day dinner. Some wounds heal. Others simply become quieter. Then one Friday afternoon in early spring, my publicist called sounding breathless. A national morning television show wanted to feature the novel. Not a local interview. Not cable access. National television. Millions of viewers. I remember gripping the edge of my kitchen counter while she explained everything because suddenly my carefully separated worlds no longer felt safely apart anymore. The host of the show had selected the novel as part of a special segment highlighting emotionally powerful American fiction. Producers wanted an on-air interview with E.M. Hayes the following week in New York. And that's when my mother unknowingly picked it up. My mother discovered the book the same way millions of people discover life-changing stories now. Accidentally. Casually. Without any understanding of how deeply personal the experience was about to become. Rachel mentioned it first during a Sunday brunch at the Carter house after seeing celebrities posting about it online. At that point, the novel was everywhere. Bookstores across the country had sold out repeatedly. Morning radio hosts discussed it during commute hours. Social media clips of emotional readers crying over the ending had already been viewed millions of times. The name E.M. Hayes had become mysterious enough that people online started inventing theories about who the author really was. Some thought it was a retired therapist writing anonymously. Others guessed a university professor. Nobody imagined the woman behind the book spent her mornings teaching multiplication to 8-year-olds near the Oregon coast. According to my cousin Melanie, who later told me everything in painful detail, Rachel brought the novel to brunch mostly because she thought it would make her seem culturally informed online. She placed the hardcover copy beside her coffee and mentioned that a famous actress had called it the emotional novel of the year. Daniel apparently rolled his eyes at first because he rarely read fiction unless it appeared on airport bestseller racks. But my mother became interested immediately after hearing how successful the book was becoming. Success always attracted Linda Carter's attention eventually. By the end of brunch, she had borrowed Rachel's copy. That part still unsettles me. For years my mother ignored nearly every meaningful part of who I was because none of it looked impressive enough publicly. Yet she spent the next 2 days completely absorbed in a novel written from the emotional ruins she helped create without realizing it. Later, my father would tell me he hadn't seen her read a book that intensely in years. She carried it from room to room. Stayed awake late finishing chapters. Cried quietly during certain scenes she refused to discuss afterward. At one point, she apparently told Rachel the author understood emotional loneliness better than most therapists. She had no idea she was describing her own daughter. Then the invitation from the national morning show arrived at the Carter house. Not for me. For her. The producers wanted several readers featured briefly during a televised discussion about the novel's emotional impact across America. My mother was selected after Rachel submitted a video of Linda talking about how deeply the story affected her. The irony of that still feels almost impossible to explain properly. The woman who spent years dismissing my emotions was now publicly praising a story built from those exact wounds. And because the author still published under E.M. Hayes, nobody connected anything. Including her. The morning of the broadcast, I sat alone inside a quiet dressing room in New York staring at my reflection while makeup artists moved around me discussing lighting schedules and commercial breaks. Outside the studio walls, producers rushed through hallways carrying clipboards and coffee cups while giant television screens replayed previews for the segment every few minutes. America's most emotional new novel, the graphics read. My stomach twisted harder each time I saw it. Nobody from the show knew the full story either. They only knew E.M. Hayes had finally agreed to reveal herself publicly for the first time during the live interview. I almost backed out twice before filming started. Not because I feared public attention. Because I feared my mother's face when she realized the truth. Part of me still wondered if exposing everything this way was cruel. Another part remembered every dinner table humiliation, every dismissive comment, every moment my family treated my existence like an inconvenience instead of a person. Somewhere between those conflicting emotions, I walked onto the studio stage and sat beneath lights bright enough to make the audience impossible to see clearly. Then the segment began. Back in Oregon, my mother sat in the Carter family living room holding a coffee mug in both hands while Rachel filmed clips for social media beside her. Daniel happened to be visiting from Chicago for business meetings and watched from the couch mostly out of boredom. My father sat quietly near the fireplace. None of them understood they were seconds away from watching the version of reality they built around me collapse completely. The host opened the segment discussing the cultural phenomenon surrounding the novel. Sales numbers. Reader reactions. Viral reviews. Audience members described crying during specific chapters. One woman said the story helped her reconnect with her estranged daughter after 8 years apart. Another admitted the novel forced her to confront how emotionally cold her own family had become over time. Then the camera turned toward my mother. Linda Carter smiled politely into the studio lights, still holding her coffee mug carefully near her lap. She looked proud to be there. Comfortable. Like someone participating in an important cultural conversation she believed reflected well on her intelligence and emotional depth. The host leaned forward slightly. What did you love most about this book? My mother paused thoughtfully before answering. And for the first time in my life, Linda Carter spoke honestly about pain. It understands rejection and loneliness in such a deep way, she said softly. Whoever wrote this must have suffered greatly. Silence followed. Not long. Just enough. Enough for the audience to absorb the weight of what she said. Enough for me to feel my heartbeat shaking against my ribs backstage. Enough for the entire moment to become irreversible. Then the host smiled gently toward the main camera. Well, she said, tonight we're joined by the author herself. Another pause. Emily Carter. The silence afterward felt endless. My mother froze instantly. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Completely. The coffee mug trembled visibly in her hands. Rachel stopped moving beside her. Daniel's expression collapsed into stunned confusion so quickly it almost looked frightening. My father slowly lowered his eyes like part of him already understood every consequence arriving at once. And my mother? Linda Carter stared toward the stage, unable to breathe properly as I walked out beneath the studio lights carrying the name she spent years trying to make feel worthless. The interview ended, but the silence it created inside my family spread much further than the television studio. By the time I returned to my hotel room in Manhattan that evening, my phone had already filled with missed calls from numbers I hadn't seen in years. Rachel called first. 7 times in under an hour. Daniel left 2 voicemails that sounded strangely formal, like he was still trying to process how the invisible sister he mocked at family dinners had somehow become the woman the entire country was suddenly talking about. My father didn't leave a message at all. But my mother. My mother called 23 times that night. I didn't answer once. Outside my hotel window, New York traffic blurred through rain while television clips from the interview spread across the internet faster than anyone expected. People online became obsessed with the reveal almost immediately. Someone uploaded the exact moment Linda Carter froze after hearing my name announced on live television, and within hours millions of people had watched it repeatedly. Viewers slowed down the footage, analyzing every facial expression at the exact second realization reached her. Comment sections filled with strangers arguing about whether my mother looked guilty, shocked, ashamed, or simply exposed. Then the internet did what it always does. It started digging. Old social media posts from Rachel resurfaced first. Luxury family photographs where I had either been cropped out completely or tagged vaguely as my sister Emily without context. People noticed the pattern immediately. Then someone found a charity event interview where my mother proudly discussed her 2 highly successful children. The clip spread everywhere within a day. Comment sections turned brutal after that. Strangers pieced together fragments of my family history from old photos, public interviews, and careless comments that once seemed harmless before the world understood what they actually revealed. But the strange thing is, none of it felt satisfying the way revenge fantasies are supposed to feel. I didn't enjoy watching my family collapse publicly. Honestly, most nights afterward I just felt tired. Because beneath all the headlines and viral reactions sat a much quieter truth nobody online fully understood. Linda Carter wasn't some monster from a movie. She was a real mother who spent so many years measuring human value through achievement and appearance that eventually she stopped recognizing her own daughter emotionally. Daniel wasn't evil. Rachel wasn't heartless. They were simply people raised inside the same system of conditional approval for so long that cruelty became normalized before any of us realized what was happening. 3 days after the interview aired, my mother finally stopped calling and sent a message instead. Just one sentence. I didn't know how much I hurt you. I stared at those words for a long time sitting alone inside my apartment above the bookstore. Rain moved softly across the harbor outside while unopened interview requests filled my email inbox faster than I could answer them. For years I imagined what it would feel like hearing my mother admit she caused me pain. I thought maybe it would heal something instantly. Instead, it just made me sad. Because deep down, part of me believed she was telling the truth. Linda Carter genuinely hadn't understood the damage she created. Not because the cruelty wasn't real, but because emotional neglect becomes invisible to people who mistake criticism for motivation long enough. I didn't respond to the message. Not that night. Not the next day. Not even the next week. Meanwhile, the novel kept growing bigger. Bookstores extended waiting lists. Interview clips reached millions of views online. Critics called the story one of the most emotionally important American novels in years. And everywhere I went, strangers thanked me for writing honestly about loneliness inside families. Women hugged me during signings while quietly admitting they saw pieces of themselves inside the story. Fathers asked me to sign copies for daughters they hoped to reconnect with. Teachers cried while telling me they finally felt respected after reading certain chapters. My entire life transformed publicly so quickly it almost stopped feeling real. But privately, one question stayed unresolved. Would I ever speak to my mother again? The answer arrived unexpectedly 2 weeks later during a bookstore signing event in Portland. The line stretched through half the building that evening. Readers carried worn copies filled with sticky notes and highlighted passages. Some people waited over 3 hours just for a 30-second conversation across a folding table covered in hardcover novels. Near the end of the night, after most of the crowd disappeared, I looked up while signing another book and saw my mother standing near the back of the store. For a second, I genuinely didn't recognize her. Not because she looked dramatically older. Because she looked smaller somehow. Linda Carter had always carried herself like someone completely certain of her place in every room. But standing there beneath the dim bookstore lights, she seemed uncertain for the first time in my life. Human. Fragile almost. She wore a plain gray coat with no makeup except tired mascara beneath her eyes. My father stood several feet behind her quietly holding his hands together like he wasn't sure whether he should even be there. Nobody around us noticed immediately. To everyone else, she was just another woman waiting quietly beside crowded bookshelves. I finished signing the final copy in front of me before the employee managing the line announced the event was over. Slowly, the bookstore emptied until only the three of us remained standing there among scattered chairs and half-finished coffee cups. My mother stepped forward carefully. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then finally, in a voice so quiet I barely recognized it as hers, Linda Carter asked the question that had probably been haunting her since the television interview. Why didn't you tell me? Not angry. Not defensive. Just broken. I looked at her standing there surrounded by stacks of the novel she once would have mocked me for writing. Then I thought about every family dinner, every interrupted conversation, every backhanded compliment disguised as concern. I thought about the group chat message excluding me from Mother's Day. I thought about sitting alone in my apartment nearly deleting 6 years of work because the people closest to me convinced me my dreams were embarrassing. And suddenly the answer felt painfully simple. Because you already decided who I was. The silence afterward stretched between us so heavily neither of us moved. Neither my mother nor I spoke for several more seconds after that. The bookstore had become completely quiet around us except for the distant sound of rain tapping softly against the front windows. Somewhere near the entrance, an employee stacked chairs slowly, pretending not to notice the tension standing motionless in the middle of the room. My father remained behind Linda Carter with his eyes lowered toward the floor, looking like a man carrying years of regret he no longer knew how to explain. Then something happened I never expected to see from my mother. She cried. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just quietly enough that it almost seemed accidental. Linda Carter pressed her hand against the edge of the signing table like she suddenly needed something stable to hold on to. For most of my life, my mother treated emotions the same way she treated wrinkles in clothing or imperfections in photographs. Things to smooth out quickly before anyone noticed. But standing there surrounded by copies of the novel she unknowingly inspired, she looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. Not exhausted from embarrassment. Exhausted from finally understanding something too late. I thought pushing you would make you stronger, she whispered. The sentence hit me harder than an apology would have. Because deep down, I believed her. That was the tragedy of my family. Very little of the damage came from hatred. Most of it came from people convincing themselves cruelty counted as honesty if they wrapped it in concern long enough. My mother genuinely believed criticism created ambition. Daniel believed success excused arrogance. Rachel believed appearances mattered because appearances had always protected her. Even my father believed silence kept families together when really it only protected the loudest people in the room. For years, I wanted revenge against them. Or at least I thought I did. I imagined dramatic confrontations where my success forced everyone to finally respect me publicly. But standing there inside that bookstore, watching my mother struggle beneath the weight of her own regret, revenge suddenly felt much smaller than I expected. Pain doesn't disappear just because the people who caused it finally recognize it. My father stepped forward carefully then. I should have said something, he admitted quietly. Years ago. I looked at him for a long moment because hearing those words from him somehow hurt even more than hearing my mother apologize. My father had loved me. I never doubted that. But love without protection leaves bruises too. Children notice who stays silent on their behalf. They remember it long after everyone else moves on. Outside, headlights moved slowly through the rain beyond the bookstore windows while the harbor fog rolled across the streets in soft gray waves. The entire moment felt strangely small compared to the years leading up to it. No screaming. No dramatic collapse. Just 3 people standing among shelves of books finally speaking honestly after decades of emotional distance. And maybe that's what real closure looks like sometimes. Not perfect healing. Not instant forgiveness. Just truth arriving quietly after years of avoidance. I never fully rejoined the Carter family after that night. Some stories don't end with everybody suddenly becoming close again because real relationships are more complicated than that. But things changed. My mother stopped measuring every human being by accomplishment alone. Daniel called more often and listened longer when we spoke. Rachel eventually admitted she spent years performing happiness online because she didn't know who she was without other people admiring her. And my father finally learned that peace built on silence eventually collapses under its own weight. As for me, success changed my life in ways people could see easily. The interviews. The travel. The bestseller lists. The opportunities one once thought only belonged to other people. But the most important change happened privately. Somewhere along the way, I stopped apologizing for existing differently than my family expected me to. Because the strange thing about finally being seen is realizing how many years you spent invisible. And once you understand that, you start viewing your entire life differently. Sometimes I still think about the version of me sitting alone in that tiny Bellport apartment years earlier, staring at a laptop screen while seriously considering deleting the manuscript completely. If I could speak to that woman now, I think I'd tell her something simple. I'd tell her survival isn't the same thing as failure. I'd tell her loneliness can convince people they are small when really they are just surrounded by the wrong voices. And I'd tell her the opinions that damage us most deeply often come from people who never truly understood us in the first place. Success didn't heal what happened. But it taught me something important. Sometimes the people who underestimate you are the same people who never took the time to know you. And maybe that's why stories matter so much. Because sometimes strangers reading your truth can see your value more clearly than the people who watched you grow up. Have you ever felt invisible to the people who were supposed to love you most? Let us know in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe for more stories about quiet resilience, family betrayal, and unexpected redemption.